What is she thinking? I don't know. You do too, no? I really don't. It is too noisy. The lunchroom was cluttered with frantic and rambunctious students who savored every second they had unconfined from the oppressive regulations of classroom teachers. Conversations were layered over one another in an ambient white noise that drowned out the barking orders of the lunch authorities, who threw firm pointed fingers at any student who tried to rise from their seat without any necessity. Food was rolling across the ground as kids launched unappealing dishes of food at one another as cannon fodder, and the school's healthier choice side orders seemed to be the most popular selection for such an honor. Dylan's recent discovery of my ability to accurately guess what someone was thinking was really getting annoying, as he continued to ask me again and again what were on the minds of nearby people. Something was telling me I shouldn't have been making a game of it. How about him? Dylan said, laughing as he pointed at the wide, slumped back of an 8th grader. The kid's head lifted and looked to his side as though he knew Dylan was pointing at him. It was Billy. I don't know, I had told him, though the truth was I never had tried. Just do it, Dylan said. Maybe he is thinking about fighting you again. I laughed and thought about it for a moment. I was curious about what Billy was thinking, now that I thought about it. I sat back in my chair and held onto my necklace, looking down into the shut eyes of the Crescent Angels. Their peaceful forms were asleep, and I preferred it that way. Billy's back was facing me as he sat slouched down at a table where 3 other loathsome beings sat quietly, equally distant from one another. They all demanded their personal space. The world began vibrating, and though it would have normally taken great concentration for me to do this, I only had to ask my request. The necklace in my fingers was my wishing charm, and my words were heard by the entities beyond the world. They would take me wherever I wished. It was something I was getting used to, and quite frankly, got better at asking. Reaching through the room was like trekking through waist-high rapids that had tides and currents pulling at me in every direction. A sudden wave of energy would come, throwing me off course, and I had to realign to find my target. These very same tides would splash into my astral eyes, causing strange hallucinogenic imagery, which tried to reshape the lunchroom into a distant and far-off setting, usually fabricated by the endless imagination of the people around me. As I threw back the waves of imaginary design, I saw my target, at the center of a bubble, that remained outside of the raging torrents. Billy was oddly peaceful, as he was seated in a small, tranquil orb that resisted the battering onrushes of the winds, while his friends around the table, or whatever they were to him, seemed to be breathing the very same vapors that warped around the room. Billy was in the eye of the storm. As I battered away the incoming streams of emotion, conversations, jealousy, and academic fever, I stretched around Billy. I was looking for an entrance, a means to get in without completely stripping my conscience of the world. I was having a hard time finding any lingering thoughts or surfacing emotions that showed itself from his exterior. As I sat outside of him, waited to see what I could find, I'd realized I was not the only one. There was something else that wanted in, something that had been there before, but had since been removed. It turned to me. It snarled in fury. Well, Dylan shook me, breaking my form of concentration. What is he thinking? I was taken aback. I looked upon in fright as the demonic imagery was still pierced into my vision. Dylan's face slowly replaced the growing creature, and I shook the terrible astral memory out of my head. It snapped back into the reality of things. Tell me, Dylan said, shaking me by my shoulders. All right, I said. He thinks you're cute. Ew, Dylan exclaimed, picking up a piece of broccoli and flinging it at me, which I carefully caught in my hands. A lunch aide came running over. Hey, no throw... Go away. He didn't throw anything. The woman with the recently shaved mustache turned away and returned to her post. Dylan looked at me with a puzzling gaze. With how strict the lunchroom rules had become, Dylan was sure he was going to face a serious consequence from throwing that micro-sized tree at me. That, however, simply did not happen, and he suspected the lunch lady turned away for other reasons beyond a generous forgiving. But this he had to prove. He reloaded, grabbed another piece of broccoli in hand, and held it over his shoulder. Don't, I warned him. They are watching us. Why didn't that last one do anything about it? Because, I had told him. Just because if you throw that, they're gonna flip out. Dylan looked at me, debating within himself whether or not to listen to me or not. Trust me, I know this. Dylan took my word for it, and dropped the broccoli onto the floor. I looked over my shoulder in the direction where I had sensed the lunch aides that were watching over us. All their heads were busy grazing over the endless hordes of students below. trying to spot anything that would potentiate mischief. I had soon found out that it wasn't them I had felt looking upon me. It was Miss Kendleton, who leaned over an iron rail from the upper part of the lunchroom, staring down at Dylan and I in careful observation. She took a meticulous note of who my friend was. My attendance to Mrs. Peterson's class was an awkward one. If I had to choose one word for it, though she did a fine job of embarrassing me as well. I walked right into class with the right attitude, as though Mrs. Peterson didn't outright try and call me a cheater the other day, while she enthralled me into a formal chamber forcing me to solve a sadistically crafted test that was designed to bring me down in every intellectual way. Had the test been encapsulated and marketed for pharmaceutical purposes, it would have been a formula to induce a migraine, but it wasn't my head that underwent the burden of the exam. That day, going back into her classroom, I would have said that I had forgiven her, or more accurately, with my short attention span taken into consideration, I simply had forgotten the entire ordeal, and so our class together started anew. Everything was smooth and fine as I wedged into the door of the classroom with my rather small backpack, when taking into comparison with the other students who prided themselves by wearing the exhaustive weight of the textbooks on their back. I sat into my seat, dropped the bag right to my side, and that was when Mrs. Peterson decided to make things weird. "Derek, that is no longer your seat," she said, as I looked around in slight confusion. At this point, of course, I was the center of attention for every student in that room. When I looked back up at her, she had her arms stuck out, pointing off to a desk near her own, off into an isolated corner. Rising from my seat and walking my way into that designated desk felt like a dead man marching to his noose. Every eye stared at me in curious wonder. It was Mrs. Peterson's way of distancing myself from the students, so I couldn't possibly copy anyone's test papers. But I thought I had proved to her the other day that such a thing was not a variable in my formula to succeed. I felt outcasted and just straight up embarrassed at this segregation from the class. She taught her class without the understanding that the position she had put me in was a neck-straining view of her teachings on the blackboard. Not that I really wanted to look at them anyways. It was just the lack of considerate thought that struck me with the profound understanding that we were to be adversaries, no matter my attempts to pass her class in silent fashion. I sat there and did what I was told. For that day, anyways. If I found myself in the same desk the next day, I could not assure Mrs. Peterson that I would not find ways of evoking a form of entertainment from her class that would make up for her unreasonable assigned seating. Gym was right after Mrs. Peterson's terrible class, which was perfect, as I was down for a serious butt-whooping. I didn't take a whole lot of imagination to picture Mrs. Peterson's head on every middle schooler student's shoulders who kissed the raw end of the dodgeball. It felt awesome, but the only concern I had was that Dylan was not there with me. He was on the bus that morning, but he did not attend gym class, and had he even possessed the courage to try and skip any of his courses, he most certainly would not have chose gym. He was at lunch with me, last I recalled, and I couldn't figure it out. I had to just assume his mother had picked him up for some strange reason, and he didn't tell me about it. "Does anybody want to do anything other than dodgeball?" Mr. Daly asked in his flippant, high-pitched, and overly sarcastic voice. He was answered by 3 oncoming dodgeballs that were pelted in his direction. "All right, I get it. Dodgeball all year. Fine with me." Mr. Daly sat back down on the bleachers and began chit-chatting with the girls in the class who wasn't fond of actively playing in the masculine sports their monstrous gym teacher had them doing. They willingly took a failing grade from their drill sergeant female designated gym teacher, as they'd rather gossip over feminine things with Mr. Daly for the 45 minutes of the class. With gym being the last class of my day, I packed up and headed for the bus. Right outside the gymnasium was where we would gather for football, but without Dylan, I really didn't see the point, and instead decided to go home. I knew I'd spend the entire time on the sideline anyway, likely talking to Sean about a topic that was not very interesting to me. It was later that I found out that Dylan did show up for football, and he remained in wonder as to where I was. "Disembark, trooper!" Grover shouted as he kicked the door lever with his foot. "Move it!" I ran out of the bus with the loose bag on my back, bouncing from side to side. I leapt off the bottom stair of the bus into Mrs. Jankowski's front yard, and around the same time, the exhaust of the bus sparked into life, and the grinding axle shafts of the vehicle squealed under pressure from the unusual demand for acceleration. Grover and his love Betsy had sped off. I walked through the front lawn into Mrs. Jankowski's backyard, where Butch ran at me with a tongue that flung globs of saliva with every bounce of his front legs. He came to a halting stop before running me into the ground and sat patiently as I patted his head with a few strokes and continued walking. Cutting through a narrow tree line that divided the neighbor's yard off from mine, I entered my property where the grass merged with the concrete sidewalks around the pool, and the lazily untouched water sat still in the rectangular underground bowl. I dropped my bag and sat down at the edge of the pool, crossing my legs along the plastic siding that made for a more comfortable climb from out of the water than the harsh surfaced concrete rock that followed after the padding. I looked into my own reflection. The water was still, and my image was clear. I could see the slight glare of the sun that rose up over me, highlighting the lustrous and varied colors in my eyes, and brightened the blondish highlights that lay dormant in my brownish hair. Lifting my right hand from where it had rested, I hovered it over the surface of the water, looking at my palm through the reflection of the water. There was so much life in there, in the seas of the pool. I dabbed my fingers into the tight surface of the water, and felt the ripples wake throughout the pool, slowly fading as they grew in distance. I lifted my finger back into view, and looked at it carefully. I observed the intricate lines carved in the surface of my flesh, the artistic weaving patterns making for their own original print that only I had had. It was a strange asset to our bodies, a finger, capable of feeling and understanding, the texture of a surface at a more heightened level than any other part of our body. They are the essence of the sensation to feel, but more than that, they can transfer that very feeling into the objects they touch. I placed my finger back into the water and watched as the ripples waked again. Tiny particles invisible to my eyes spoke in frequencies to neighboring lakes, telling them and instructing them with orders of where to move and what to be. The tide in the water was a physical reflection, a reaction to my touch, the imparting of lightly bonded particles that scattered at the force of my finger plummeting into their loosely held forms. I called them back. The small vibrations elevated in frequency. The speed at which the particles' form would shiver was a means to communicate to the drifting waters, and they recalled the fleeting waves in a magnetized bond. I watched as the waves turned directly and enclosed in on my finger. I continued the vibrations, reaching further through the pool. A line of ripples slowly flowed down the center of the body of water. They sped up, obeying the communication from my finger to their electrical forms, and the rapid ripples in the confined lines at the center of the pool had quickened, making tiny whirlpools below the water's surface. Misting clouds arose from the energized molecules that reached a heightened state, and their liquid forms turned immediately to vapor after receiving such an enormous amount of energy. Everything obeyed to my wishes. The foundational source of life was at my command. Mrs. Jankowski was walking through her yard. I could feel her old and aging heart beating, her mind thirsting for conversation, but she had few of whom she could talk to. She walked into my yard. I retracted my finger from the water, watching the rising mist condensate back into the pool, and the fast, shivering surface of the water came to a halting stop. "Derek, how are you, sweetie?" Mrs. Jan's voice was soft and carried throughout the air without disturbing the harmony in the winds. With every new day, I began to welcome our conversation together, as her mind was always at peace. She was calm and tranquil, unlike every other being I had encountered. She was free of the lurking desires and unnecessary ambitions into areas that promised nothing of virtue to our lives. She was old, and that may have been the reason why she remained untouched. She lacked the youthful energies that screamed so loudly to the otherworldly entities. "I'm okay," I told her, still looking into the water, at its now silent and still surfaces. "I haven't been seeing you lately, coming off the bus at your normal time." Mrs. Jan's voice shared hints of concern and disappointment. "I was playing football after school." "Oh, football," Mrs. Jan said with surprise. "I didn't think you'd be the type." "I don't know if I like it yet. I didn't go today." She walked closer to me, standing by my seated side. She would have sat down with me if she wasn't so concerned about not being able to get back up. It took enough courage as it was for her to linger outside her front door and to trot through the small tree lines separating our yards. Her knees sure weren't what they used to be. "Your face is too pretty to be playing such a rugged game, sweetheart. You don't want to hurt yourself and get your sister all concerned now, do you?" "No," I said. She never liked any of those kind of sports. I nearly laughed, knowing Kristen's new interest in Sean, the captain of a football team. I decided not to tell Mrs. Jankowski. I wasn't even sure if the two would really make a connection. Mrs. Jan, I thought for a second. If I had superpowers, what am I supposed to do with them? She had smiled at that idea, thinking I was lost in my own imagination. Well, you're supposed to use them for good. Help the needy. Who's the needy? You know, people who need the help. Need rescuing from the bad guys, she chuckled, finding the conversation rather comical. What if I'm the bad guy? Oh, honey, Mrs. Jan risked kneeling down to get to eye level with my seated form. You're not the bad guy. You're too sweet. Her soft hand caressed the side of my face. Perhaps she was right, but I couldn't be too certain. With every night I am plagued with visions of destruction, and the inevitable decadence of the world is played out before me. My mother, as much as I possess the natural love for her, tells me endlessly that it is all because of me. She reminds me that I am the cancer of this world, an undying cell that does not play by the rules, that I am the cause of all of it, and how can a hero be the one to bring ruin to the world? If you had a superpower, what would it be? I turned to look up at Mrs. Jankowski curiously. Her smile was most welcoming. I would want to heal people, to cure their wounds, and stop them from hurting. The creature snarled, sniffing the air around me with its giant sniveling snout. Snot fired from its nostrils as it savored the scent of my living form, and it took all its efforts to restrain itself from devouring me. It would not touch me, for it knew the consequence, but it wanted my life. Go away, I asked it nicely. Its stench was terrible, and it reeked of growing decay. Large thorny spines breached through the hard leather skin on its back, while the skulls of men were impaled on the peaks to make for an gory trophy display. A large, slithering tongue curled into the back of its throat, as it spat out gurgling growls and sentence structures. In delay, I could hear its translated words. Spoiled boy, how I would flay the flesh of your body, drink from your dying soul, and taste the traces of divinity in your blood. Mother, I whispered, with closed eyes, as the terrible words of the demon crackled in my head. I wanted it gone from here. She had appeared. Her long, pale white and sleek form stepped out from the distant shadow, and the snout-nosed creatures turned hard on its heels, and cowered in the other direction. She showed no regard for the beast as it skittered off across dark plague grounds before long wreathing tendrils sprouted from the path before it, and it stumbled into their whipping reaches. Its body was torn into shreds, and its remains were swallowed in the black, erupting cloud. Derek, she said in a vengeful tone, why do you do this to me? I don't. My voice was fragile, and hardly could find words to speak. She stepped closer. Long black robes splayed around her pale lower legs. They were not robes. They were shadows, and their shape changed endlessly, molding around her moving form. I could sense her anger, her disappointment, and heard her assumption that I simply was not learning my lesson. She thrust her arm outward, her long, gothic nails pointed at me, and I stepped back several steps as though I could run away. The shadow cast from the tips of her fingers had streamed through the air, faster than I could backpedal, and then they embedded deep into my eyes. They are learning. I was following Miss Kendleton again. She walked through the halls with an eager pace. Her mind was set, and an objective was in play. She found the boy she had seen earlier who had sat by my side at the lunch table. She called out his name. Dylan. She waited for the boy to turn. He looked at her with apprehensive eyes before looking back down the hall the way he was heading. His lower lip was corked, a sign of nervousness. Dylan, I am Miss Kendleton. I was just wondering if I could have a few words with you. When the boy's nervous face did not seem to change, she substituted for a lighter approach. It is nothing bad, just a few questions. Derek had said you were one of his friends. It was a lie, but Dylan didn't know that. She could see the simple mentioning of his friend had brought a lighter mood to the atmosphere, and she placed a hand behind him, edging him to come with her to her office. Dylan didn't really want to miss gym class, but this lady seemed nice. The world dissipated, forming into a small gray cloud that fired streaks of lightning across its form before it grew back into its original size. It swallowed me again, taking me to another time. So, when did you find this out? Miss Kendleton asked, avoiding the old formal approach that had failed miserably on me. Like the other day, I asked him to guess a number. It was like some billion and something, and he knew it. Dylan told the story with excitement. Really now? That is something. That is something. I always thought Derek was special. Has he shown you anything else? Miss Kendleton pried for more information. They mustn't know. The world had crumbled, and I was then among the stars, standing on a transparent surface while the galaxy spun below me. Great stretching nebulas surfed across the enormous spiral, wrapping their long forms around the small glowing orbs within the gravitational mass. Why? I had whispered to myself, fearful that my question would result in terrible reprimand. She looked at me, with her cold eyes partially hidden behind long streaks of black hair. They will hurt you, she spoke, her words cold and with malice. No, they won't. They can't. You will protect me. I am dying! Her screech blistered my ears, and I fell to the hard surface, clutching my head and shutting my eyes, trying to keep the agony out of my head. You are killing me. I pried my eyes open and looked down at the universe below. There were trillions of stars, flowing in the slow orbit around the galaxy. Their lights were bright and resonated with life. They were staring at me, and I could feel their sympathy. I lifted my head, and the shadows around her began to fade. They fell onto the floor like disrobed clothing, dissipating into gray clouds before vanishing entirely, leaving her naked and scarred body before me. I am dying, Derek, and you are killing me. Her hands gripped at the large scars around her abdomen. Dark red blood dripped from the crevices of a giant gash. I will no longer be able to protect you. I am sorry, I said, holding back tears as the sense of dread washed over me. How could I be doing such a terrible thing? She appeared before me, her disgusting and rotting form but inches from my face. She placed a curled nail under my chin, its touch colder than ice. You have to make it stop. I had given you a gift, Derek, and you had abused it. The world is rotting because of it. I am dying because of it. She stepped back, her fingers slowly slipping away from my chin as it turned and pointed at the necklace that dangled under my neck. The gold inlaid angels watched with venomous eyes, unwavering in the sight of her. Their eyes, orbs that shined like diamonds, circulated with hidden energies, and their gaze followed wherever she went. Destroy it, she told me. No, I shouted. My mother gave it to me. I am your mother. No, you're not, I shouted, grabbing a hold of the necklace, and the angel screamed at my distress, shattering the floor below me. I fell slowly into the galaxy below. She had vanished, and the dread that she had brought with her had left as well. There were hidden faces in the darkness of space, their peeking eyes looming out of every direction, and their lips were peeled back to reveal the thirsting teeth below. They all watched me from shadowy corners, as I fell towards the worlds below. They wanted me, but I was protected, and had it not have been for that, I could feel the endless torment that my soul would have undergone, under the thousands of entities that wanted my life force. A great red giant hummed in vibrant light below. It was massive. A star that warmed the hundreds of spherical rocks that orbited its gravitational pull. It was growing, accumulating energies from the distant life forms that were under its casting rays, and I fell into its embrace. Great glowing tendrils flared up from its oceans of fire, and wrapped around my falling body, slowing its descent. I was cradled by the dancing flames, and warmth was instilled into my soul. Streaks of light ran along the surface of my body, streaming within my blood, while the harnessing energies gathered within my chest. The sensation felt natural. It was genuine, perfect, a feeling of complete homeostasis. It lacked the blissful excess of most emotions, but was just enough to feel its warming presence. It was the perfect medium of all feelings, and they started here, at the heart of a star. Everything around me remained still, and for once I had been in absolute control of everything, every thought, and every emotion that came over me. It was wonderful, but the angels thought differently. They screamed, as though their very essence was burning alive. I awoke, tears trickling from my eyes, not in fright, but from the beauty I had seen. The loud hum of the dryer replaced the harmonizing flames of fire, and the old furrowed rug I laid upon replaced the birthing flares of life. I felt weak, and refused to move. My sister came running into the room. yelling my name. Derek, what was all that screaming about? What are you doing down here? She continued, asking questions without time for me to speak. She dropped to her knees and slid over to me, wrapping her arms around my curled form, snuffing out the freezing aches within my limbs, and instilling fiery warmth within my chest. Derek, what the hell is wrong? Kristen asked frantically, lifting my face to hers. I just realized that I was in the basement cellar, unable to recall how I got there. She said I was killing her, I had told her. Who did? Mother? Kristen pressed me against her chest, bringing me into her silent world. I could not feel nor hear the life around me anymore. She did not say anything, just kept rocking my form back and forth. I felt my necklace hitting against my chest. I rose out of her arms, pulling at the golden chains, trying to snap the grasp the jewel had around my neck. Derek, what are you doing? My sister demanded, grabbing a hold of my hands and squeezing them tight enough to force me to let go. I don't want it anymore. Take it away, I begged. Take what away? The dreams. I don't want to see her anymore. I gave up, falling back down onto the ground. She didn't want the necklace, and I didn't know why. But if I got rid of it, would it change it all? The angels were quiet, as they always were in this world. I sat there on the rug, thinking back to everything I had been told. How could the very thing my mother had given me be the object that was causing her to die? How could the angels, a symbol of good, of virtue, but something that would cause someone harm? She was already dead. There was no way to kill those who had already passed. Do you always dream of her?